Right, well, welcome everybody to today's WIN meeting. We've got Michael Roberts coming to speak to us on the economy, and then we can have a discussion afterwards. Michael, how long do you want to speak for? You're going to speak for 30 minutes, and I'll tell you after 20, yeah?
Yeah.
Brilliant. All right. Can I just ask everybody to mute as well if they're not actually speaking, so we don't get any sound interruption. Right, okay, off you go.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Let me just say that this afternoon I was just checking the latest world COVID figures before we started the meeting. We now have just over 180 million people who have got a case of COVID since the pandemic started. And I think it was just, let me double check, it was just, yes, just under 4 million people now have died from the COVID pandemic. That's about 0.5% or so when we take everything into account. On a world scale, much higher in the advanced countries of Northern Europe and so on. So something between 0.5% and 1%. It turns out to be the infection rate. That's approximately 5 to 10 times more deadly than annual influenza virus. So it's proved to be a very dangerous pandemic for humanity. And yet, as some scientists have been recently pointing out, as pandemics go and as pathogens go in the recent period, this is probably one of the least deadly pandemics. Earlier SARS pandemics, Ebola and so on were much more deadly. It's just that they were less they didn't spread as much. They were not so infectious that they could get around the world. And of course, as we now know, the reason it's been, even at this level, which it could have been much worse, but it could have been much better if preventative activities have been taken by governments around the world. They were warned of these pandemics and they've done nothing about them beforehand. And if health systems around the world hadn't either been completely neglected, starved of funds, privatized, or just non-existent in many countries in the world. So not only was there no warning, no prevention, no organization once it got underway from the health systems, and of course, as we know in the case of the UK, but not just the UK, total bungling and outright corruption in the case of the UK in the handling of this particular virus pandemic. But, and that's what we're going to talk about now, what's happening to the world economy now as the pandemic seems to be coming to an end? As Chair was saying, well, infection rates are up again in Britain, so I don't understand why the lockdowns are coming to an end. Well, yes, one reason could be that capitalism cannot go on with a lockdown if it's survived and sustain businesses. But the other reason is, of course, the infection rates may still be high, particularly in Latin America and rising in some countries, but the death rates are dropping very fast, at least in the advanced capitalist economies, because of the rollout of the vaccinations. So now, for example, I think it stands today that those being in hospital for COVID now in the UK, there are more of them who have been vaccinated than not vaccinated. How's that possible? What it means, of course, is that the hospitalization death rates have fallen so much that it is now pretty exceptional for somebody who's caught COVID to get really ill, because even if you're vaccinated, you can still catch it, but the impact upon you is much less than before you were vaccinated. But we do have, according to latest figures, 2 million people in Britain who are suffering from what is now called long COVID, which means that they've got permanent or substantial and significant illnesses that have not gone away as a result of the virus, despite getting over the initial symptoms and so on, all sorts of things. And we're still learning more about the long-term damage that COVID's done to the health of humanity. But what I want to talk about is the long-term damage that's done to the world economy, people's livelihoods and jobs. We are in a process now, at least in the advanced capitalist countries, of recovering from the crisis economically, after the deep slump that we saw in 2020, the worst slump in 100 years in most countries around the world, the worst slump in 300 years in the case of the UK, an indication of how severe it was. But then the recovery has also been quite sharp and dramatic as businesses start to open up, and the conditions for expansion of production and people starting to spend a bit more money has led to a recovery in the economy. So now I'm going to show you a few graphs, which I hope I can share. Prospects for the world economy. Well, the first thing to say is that from the beginning of 2021 and onwards, we're now seeing one of the strongest recoveries in the major economies in global output since the Second World War. Of course, we saw the deepest slump. I think some people still got not muted. We saw the deepest slump in 2020, but now we're seeing a fast recovery. You can see on this very initial graph the sharp rise in the trajectory of growth. If you're starting at 100 at the end of the recession, of various recessions, you can see that the 2020 recession that we had is now expected within only 3 years to have gone, on average, led to a rise in global output of 14% from the depth of the 2020 recession. And that's a very fast recovery compared to some other slumps and recovery that we've seen in previous years under capitalism. But of course, it's not an even recovery. If you look on the left-hand side of this graph, this is the number of countries that are going to exceed the pre-recession per capita peak after 2 years. These are different recessions. You can see that 75% of countries in the recession of 1945-6, after 2 years, were above where they were at the beginning of that 2 year slump. Same figure for 1975 at the end of that slump. But on the whole, something like half to 60% of economies after 2 years are back or above where they were at the beginning of the slump. Of course, there's 2 years of slump. That's really bad for everybody, but the recovery takes place. But in this case, on overall, it's not been a recovery that's going to be quite for all countries. Only 50% of countries, according to the IMF, will recover to be where they were 2 years ago at the end of 2019 by the end of 2021. And that's mainly in the advanced countries. You can see a very sharp recovery there because we've got the vaccines, we've got the fiscal and monetary stimulus, we've got a lot of things going for us if we're living in the advanced economies of capitalism. While if we look on the right-hand scale, the EMDE means the emerging economies, the developing ones, the poor countries, in other words, you can see that only about 30 to 40% of economies after 2 years, after the end of 2022, will be in a position where they will be equal to where they were at the end of 2019. So that means the vast majority of the poorest countries in the world will not have recovered by the end of 2021 to where they were before. And as I'll show you, where they're likely to get to in the near future. In fact, the whole of the slump, in the pandemic slump, has really been most damaging of all to the poorest countries of the world. And the poorest countries in the world in this graph, if we start in 2020, AE means that's the advanced capitalist economies. They fell by 7% in 2020. The developing poor countries fell by more than that, close to or nearly 7. If you exclude China, then all the other poor countries fell by 8%, and the very, very poor countries fell by 6%. In 2021, you can see, if you exclude China and the advanced countries, that this fall in 2021 was really heavy for the developing and poorest countries. And it's not much better in 2022. They will remain down again, while the advanced capitalist economies will be recovering, as we've seen already that has started taking place. If we add it all together, we can see in the green block, those poor countries, excluding China, will have lost something like 20% of their national outputs over the period of 2020 to 2022, over 2 years. That's the damage that's been done to the economy. Well, that's a figure. What does it mean in reality? It means people's jobs, it means people's incomes, it means the prospects for better services, for the opportunities to expand conditions and improve conditions for people in the so-called global south. 20% of the ability to do that, which is limited enough as it was, will have been lost outside the advanced countries and China. It's still pretty bad in the advanced countries, something like a 12% cumulative loss over 2 years. While that's been going on, of course, it's not been evenly distributed. The losses and the gains have not been evenly distributed, not only between countries, but of course, within countries. The rich, the very super rich, the billionaires, have actually increased their wealth during the pandemic. So, for example, in the case of Russia, if you take the position of how many billionaires and what their share of GDP was at the end of, before the pandemic started, Russia, nearly 25% billionaires in Russia had nearly 25% of annual Russian GDP. Now that's 35%. There's been a dramatic increase in the wealth as a percentage of GDP for Russian billionaires. And a country that people often don't realize, so-called social democratic Sweden, has a very high number of billionaires who control nearly 20% of Sweden's GDP, and that's rocketed to nearly 30%, the equivalent. And we can go down the list there. The UK's billionaires seem to have a relatively low amount of a share of GDP. It's not risen very much, but of course that's billionaires. We're only talking about billionaires here. We're not talking about the rich beneath billionaires. The very super rich have dramatically increased their wealth during the pandemic. On the other hand, there has been death and destitution for millions of people across the world under the COVID slump. 20 million life years. That means you add up a number of life expectancy reduction and the number of people, 20 million life years have been lost to COVID-19 by the end of December 2020. And over the same period, they expected another 120 million additional years were lost, spent in poverty. So in other words, the number of people have fallen into the World Bank's poverty level, which is very, very low. So you've really got to be poor to be at that level. The number of years that they're going to be at that poverty level means if you add it all together and all the number of people, it's 120 million additional years of poverty for people around the world. And a recent report says that the poverty consequences of the pandemic have been missed, has given less importance than the number of deaths. That's bad enough. But to realize the permanent damage that's been done to people's lives and livelihoods in terms of employment, income, and the ability to have a decent life has been suffered badly. Nevertheless, the major economies are beginning to recover. As I said, this has been driven partly by the huge amount of injections of credit that's gone into the major economies from the central banks. They've kept their interest rates down dramatically. Of course, most of that money's gone into financial speculation. That's why the stock markets are at their maximum at the moment. But of course, it's also helped provide resources by printing money to keep people from starving to death in these lockdowns. And across most of the major capitalist economies, there's been fiscal support for the first time. There's been spending by the government, both for COVID relief, which is, if you take the US one, it's the green bit, by support for people being unemployed in the US here. And more recently under Biden, there's going to be a new stimulus program to try and get the economy motoring up. And that's quite a large amount as a percentage of 2019 GDP that the US administration is both Trump and Biden have been spending in fiscal support, and other countries of varying degrees down there. So lots of cheap money, mainly for speculation, but also to keep companies and banks and others going. And to some extent, fiscal stimulus to keep people's incomes up and surviving through benefits and so on. Of course, all this is going to come to an end as we go through the rest of this year and into 2022. So everything depends on whether the economies of the world are going to recover sufficiently so that governments don't have to keep printing money and spending money this way. What we've also seen in the very near period, this recovery isn't really, it's taking the form partly of an increase in national output, but also a very sharp increase in inflation of food and energy prices in the shops and so on in the major capitalist economies. People are probably experiencing that if they've noticed the sorts of fees that people are charging or the restaurants are charging if they're going to cafes and so on. There's a big change taking place in the price of these goods and others in energy and so on. I call this a sugar rush. what it means is a lot of money. People, the better off people in the economy have not been out of work or on furlough and so on. They've been able to work at home and still being paid. They haven't been able to spend that money, so it's built up as a lot of savings, and now it's starting to come out on trying to go on holiday and all the rest of it. And the result is that there's a big demand for products like that, leisure and so on, and yet the suppliers cannot really provide that immediately, because international supply chains have been weakened under COVID, and there's been a sharp increase in commodity prices. What do we mean by commodity prices? We mean agricultural products for food, we mean energy, we mean metals for manufacturing and so on. That prices of those have shot up. There's a big, strong demand, and this means that inflation has taken a huge hike. On the right-hand side of this, we can see the graph here. This is the inflation rate in the US currently. So you can see it used to be around about even lower than 2%, previous years around 2%. And then in the pandemic, it dropped to 0, no inflation at all, and now it's rocketed up to 5%. The issue amongst a lot of discussion amongst the governments and their economists is whether this inflation will continue and continue to damage people's incomes and so on. Instead of getting a sustained increase in output and in technology and productivity, we may get an inflation burst. But at least this is just a sugar rush. You know what happens in sugar rushes? Take a lot of sugar to get a lot of energy to boost you going, and then next day you get a hangover and you feel terrible and right down. And that's the danger that exists in the world economy at the moment. In fact, the OECD, which is the big international agency, forecasts where output will be over the next period of a few years. You can see that it goes up to the end of 2022. Look at the red line. Here is the slump caused by the pandemic during the pandemic years, bottoming out at the middle of last year, then a recovery in output. This is index that was 100, so it's dropped down into 90, and then a recovery. But this is where the trajectory would have been, the blue line, if things had not had a pandemic, and everything had carried on at the same rate as before. But you can see that none of these forecasts by the OECD suggest we will return to that blue line by the end of 2022, if at all. In fact, the most likely base case is the red line. And the red line suggests, yes, most capitalist economies will be above 100 by the end of 2022, which is where they started at the beginning of 2020, but they won't be at 110 where they ought to be if there'd been no slump at all. And in fact, you can see that they're not likely to get back to that trajectory at all. Now, I call this a reverse square root. Those of you who remember your school arithmetic knows that the square root goes like that. Whoops. Goes across like down and then over. On here, we're not actually returning to the same trajectory. It's a reverse of the square root. So that's a sort of recovery we're having, not a V. The capitalist economists hope to have a V. You go down here, then shoot back to the blue line. But it's not happening, and it's not likely to happen. So even in the best economies, we can expect actually a failure to return to the previous trajectory of growth, slower growth in effect. And why is that? Well, because before the pandemic, the world economy as a whole was slowing down. These are the annual growth rates each year for the world since 2010. You can see back there, it was around 5% growth rate overall. That includes China, India, everybody, the fast-growing ones. And it was around 3.5% for the world. But in the last year before the pandemic, it actually dropped below 3%. Considering the population growth in the world is at least 1% overall, in some countries much higher, then that's an even lower figure when you take into account output per person. And if you compare it to the 10-year average, the 2019 figure is way, way below, in Latin America in particular, hardly anywhere close to the 10-year average, while in Europe, it's been, in 2019, it was slower than the 10-year average. So the world economy was slowing down before we got to the pandemic, even before we get to it. Productivity growth was slowing. Look at this blue line. This shows you over the years, and what is productivity growth? It's the amount of output produced per worker working. It's the productivity of each worker. And capitalism is failing to expand the productivity of growth. for workers. And if it doesn't, then we don't get the resources, the needs that we can to meet people's needs.
20 minutes, Michael.
And so we're so well down. We're really slowing down badly. And the reason behind that is a huge decline in investment in productive sectors of the economy. Fixed asset investment in the major economies has been dropping fast all over those years as well. So low productivity growth is caused by low investment growth. And in my view, that's caused by the fact that there is a general fall and a tendency for fall in the rate of profit, the profitability of capitalism across the world. This left-hand graph shows you the decline in profitability, not in a straight line, but overall, if you take the secular decline, profitability is nearly at its lowest level in the top 20 countries in the world for capital. Capital is not investing because profitability is low. And if you look at the G7, again, you can see it's very low, the top 7 economies. And just before the pandemic broke, the actual total amount of profits in the major economies, corporate sectors, was actually zero or even negative. So that there was no, they were moving into a recession anyway before the pandemic happened. And to get out of this is going to be difficult for capitalism because already, as a result, business debt is at a record high. Look at this figure, it goes back to 1870. And this is the amount of debt relative to the amount of GDP in lots of global economies, 17 in fact. And you can see that it's up here, well above 100%, or well above 1 to the 1 ratio. So it's really high, the highest it's ever been. So there's a lot of debt out there. And if there's no profit and the debt's high, it's very difficult for companies to begin to grow, apart from this sugar rush they've got to get going. Because the debt burden will hold back productivity. This is just a measure of productivity against debt. So productivity against debt is falling very sharply and was falling before the pandemic began. So it's a real struggle for capitalism to develop productive forces. We estimate that something like 15 to 20% of companies in the major economies now are what we call zombies. What we mean by that is the living dead, if you like, or the undead, is that these companies are just making enough profit to cover the interest costs on the debt that they've taken out, the money that they've borrowed in order to survive. They can pay the wages of their workers just about and the interest on it, but they can't expand because they're not making enough profit. So if there's any rise in interest rates and debt costs for them, not only will they not grow, they can well go bust. That's the risk that lies ahead. Let me complete my argument here on what's going to happen now to consider a Marxist view of how you get a boom. Marx said you get a boom when there's been a sufficient slump in the old capital values so that the cost of production are reduced. That can happen through destruction and war, but also happen through bankruptcies, through a reduction in the stock markets, through takeovers by other companies. So devaluation takes place in order to create conditions for higher profitability for those that survive. It's a form of creative destruction, said an Austrian economist, Joseph Schumpeter. So it's breaking up the old monopolies and replacing them with a new set of companies that have got the advance to go ahead. And so it can be physical, as I said, through the process of destruction in a war, but it can also just be due to the prices of things. Prices of things fall because bankruptcies take place, companies are bought up cheap, and we have a new situation. There's also destruction of the stock market and the bond market, which Marx, those values Marx called fictitious. We get rid of the fictitious capital, that can create the conditions for a new boom based on profitability. Of course, none of those things are applying at the moment. The post-pandemic problems remain with us, and I'll finish on this chair. We have rising inequality of income and wealth. Nothing has changed. It's the same as before the pandemic. In fact, the poverty that I've described already has never been so bad. According to the UN, even before the pandemic, 3.4 billion people, nearly half the world, lived on less than $5.50 a day. And that's not changed for the last 30 years, according to the UN's special rapporteur. And of course, the major problem of global warming and climate change, a 1 in 5 chance now that global temperatures will be above the so-called Paris limit target of 1.5 degrees warmer than pre-industrial times. within the next 5 years. It could even be quicker than that, according to some reports. And of course, you have massive environmental destruction, opening up the possibility of yet more pandemics, because that's where they came from when the remote areas of the world where pathogens have existed in wild animals have come into contact through various industrial farming and other markets into human beings, as far as we can tell. And of course, there's the real danger that in this crisis situation for the world, that the tensions that are developing at an intensive and increasing rate between the US and China could lead to major confrontation. It's a grotesque inequality of wealth at the moment. This is the very latest figure from the Credit Suisse annual global wealth report. I just want to bring this to attention, that there are 56 million people, that's all, 56 million people out of more than 4 billion adults who have approximately 46% of global personal wealth. So just 1% has 46% of global personal wealth. Those people who have wealth more than 100,000 to 1 million, that's another 11%. If you add that together, combine it, you get something like 85% of all personal wealth is held by 12% of the world's adults. By the way, if you've got a house and it's worth just 100,000 and there's no mortgage on it, you're up there. You're rich, according to the world's wealth pyramid. And most of us wouldn't consider that a £100,000 house in the UK with no mortgage makes you super rich by any standard. But that's what it would mean globally. Why is that? Because the number of adults who've got absolutely nothing is nearly 3 billion, or 55% of the world's population. So that's why that ratio ends up like that. These people at the bottom of the pyramid have absolutely nothing after they've paid their debts. No wealth of any sort, property, and obviously not financial, no cash savings, nothing. And yet, in the last year, we've seen a massive increase in the number of millionaires, another 5 million millionaires in the world in wealth terms. It's not income, this is what they own, either in property or in wealth. And some of those millionaires are obviously in Britain, but you can see most of them in the US. The biggest increase has been in the US. Doesn't take much if your property prices rise for some people to hit the millionaire status. And yet we have more poverty. The absolute number of people living in extreme poverty rose during the COVID for the first time since 1997. And we don't, according to, again, a new report by the UN, they don't expect global poverty headcounts to fall below 2019 levels until 2023. And in the case of many countries, this is Nigeria, this is other countries, the poor ones, if it's blue and it's up, that means that they've got more poverty. By 2030, they will still have more people in poverty, 588 million in total, than existed before COVID began. So none of these problems have been going to be resolved by capitalism. As I say, the climate crisis, no sign that this rise in global emissions is going to decline. It did briefly in the COVID, but now we're heading back upwards again to new levels with the dangers of hitting a terrible level of global warming which will damage the world. It's a ticking time bomb, says the UN. There doesn't seem to be, we're going to have tens of millions more people in chronic hunger, 130 more million in extreme poverty, coastal cities will be flooded, there's going to be droughts across the world, increasingly so in those areas which are already suffering from drought, heat, bushfires, and all the rest of it. Nothing, as far as we can see, is being done by capitalism to solve this and the growing environmental crisis, the destruction of species, plant and animal species across the world, and a complete lack on the right-hand side of sufficient capital investment to turn that around and make it possible for people to live in habitable conditions and for species to survive. And yet, every possibility of more pandemics. There's no indication that there's going to be enough spent on looking at dealing with the dangers of further epidemics or pandemics that come from pathogens in the future, because the conditions that created them have not gone away. Antonio Guterres of the UN has said, world economy is now at a breaking point. It's shown that free markets don't work. They don't deliver healthcare for all, and that if we live in a post-racist world is a total delusion, or that it's a myth that we're all in the same boat. He says it's time for global leaders to do something about this. Of course, we know very well that the current bunch of global leaders who appeared in Thomas Bay, Cornwall recently have no intention, have no ability and no intention of doing anything about these major issues. What we need is a complete transformation of what we consider the right things to do. It's capitalism that's generating these crises of environmental pollution, industrial farming, climate change, and so on, with more pandemics to come. The market clearly doesn't work, whether it be the COVID crisis, the next pandemic, or the climate crisis. We need state and government action internationally, and it's exposed the situation where most workers who do the most important jobs are the ones who are least valued in that came out in the COVID slump, and the people who are least important, least relevant, least unproductive have made the biggest gains in this crisis. Private healthcare and big pharma has failed humanity. We need free public healthcare across the world and massive public investment in research and production of medicines and vaccines. Instead of bailing out big business, we need to take them over and plan them for the interests of the population as a whole. And we need to end the shocking levels of debt left on the backs of poor people around the world, while on the other hand, the rich get away with socking their money away in tax havens to huge amounts. Key ownership of the major public services that were necessary both to help us in the crisis, but also in the future, were required. We can't go on with a situation where a few monopolies control everything and rule the roost.
You have 30 minutes, Robert. Michael.
That's me. I'm just about finished. I'm just trying to get rid of that share, and there I am. So that's how I see the world economy at the moment. Those are the issues that I think the labour movement faces, and we must therefore consider what our best course of action is to try and fight for improvement in conditions of working people around the world. Thank you, Pam.
Thanks, Michael, for that extremely good and extremely clear, if very terrifying, review of what's going on. Obviously, this presenting to people, we really are on the cusp of barbarism or socialism, and something has to happen soon. I'm just wondering if your slideshow's available, Michael, because it really was very good.
Yes, it will be available. In fact, I'll
Excellent.
Put it onto the chat. Otherwise, it'll be on my Facebook soon.
Brilliant, that's great. I think that'll be very useful. Well, that was absolutely excellent and fantastically well within your time as well. So now throw this open to discussion. Would somebody like to come in and say something? Carol, hooray, somebody's rescued us.
Yeah, mine's a very practical question. Being a mother and a grandmother, I do most of the shopping and the cooking in my house. And one of the things I've noticed recently, and I want to know, Michael, from you, whether you think that this is going to increase, is the lack of certain goods in the shops. And I know it's worrying people and it's worrying me. So today I went into Tesco's, and it's only a small one of the Tesco extras, and there were, I think, 3 pizzas in the whole of the frozen food section. Was hardly any fruit, and that is really worrying. And I mean, I don't know, I know that there's issues around Brexit that overlay the examples that you gave, and I just wonder, what the future is going to hold in terms of supply of goods into British supermarkets. If you could perhaps give a view on that, please.
Well, Carol's right. I'm experiencing exactly the same thing as you. I'm in a small town at the moment. I've been hiding here. It's normally in London, but for the last year or two, I've been hiding in the countryside, as we middle classes can manage to do. And I've just got a small Tesco's Express up the road, and exactly the same situation, particularly at the weekends. I think there are first of all some practical reasons. Apparently, there's a severe shortage of truck drivers and delivery drivers, and so the big depots haven't got enough truck drivers to distribute the stuff to the shops. Why is that? Well, apparently they used to have a load of European EU truck drivers who, of course, could come over here and work. They've all been either left or been shunted out of the country, and for some reason, Brits don't want to go through a £3,000 HGV course in order to become an employee of Tesco's and etc. to drive trucks all over the country at all hours of the day and night. Doesn't seem very attractive, at least to the available workforce that might be here in the UK. course, we're experiencing that in other sectors of the economy as well, the health service and education and so on. And this is obviously partly to do with Brexit and the inability to provide a distribution service. The supply chain is broken down between Europe and the UK to some extent. And apparently it could get worse because we still haven't resolved a lot of the issues relating to how to move particularly food goods across the channel by truck and by other means to provide resources. Not only is UK exports to Europe collapsing, but the ability to import EU imports has become more difficult with all the documentation and the lack of staff. I think that's part of it. But the other reason, I think, is also the after effects of the COVID pandemic. As I mentioned, global supply chain, which is a sort of economist word for saying what's happened is that if you're a car company like Volkswagen, you have your engines built, maybe in Germany, but you have your other bits, electronics built in Taiwan and other Asian countries, and then they send that to Spain where they're going to assemble it. They assemble a bit, send it over to Mexico to assemble a bit more, and then they send it back to the retail markets in Europe. So can you believe it that a Volkswagen car, for example, is probably made in 6 or 7 global destinations before it comes together as one car? This is called the global supply chain, which of course has totally collapsed. Well, that's an exaggeration, but it's become very difficult to sustain it during the lockdowns in various countries. And the result has been a severe shortage of motor car parts. This is just one industry, it applies to others. And in particular, the electronic parts, things like copper and so on, which are so more important, particularly in electric cars, there's been a severe shortage of the requirements and also the specific software and diagnostics that go into cars these days. So there's been a dramatic fall in the amount of available new cars, a huge waiting list taking place to be met by supply, and it isn't. Result is that there's been I don't know if it's the case in the UK, but in the US, there's been an absolute shoot up in used car prices. Used cars used to be dead easy to buy for virtually nothing. All the problem was the cost of insurance and so on. But now used car prices in the US have rocketed. And so this is being feeding through to the inflation. So that's just one sector. A lot of other sectors are like that. Now, will this last? Well, I think that's a question for whether the supply chains can return, whether there's going to be the sort of development in new technology, perhaps reducing the requirements in certain areas. There's been attempts apparently for companies to bring back their sourcing of all these bits of materials to one place. That's going to be more expensive and more difficult to do. I think it's going to be some time before they overcome this particular hump, if you like, in supply. And so we're going to see even the possibility, at least in the UK, of shortages, because we've got the double whammy of Brexit on top of that. But other countries will definitely see, we are seeing rises in food prices, energy prices, which are not going to go away quickly while this supply chain problem is there. Finally, Sharon, just have to say that one of the big difficulties of returning to an international trading global supply chain, which has been built up by capitalism over the last 30 years, is the battle between the US on this and China on this supply chain. That now the US is blocking everything China does. China wants to open up a technology thing, it's being blocked. The Chinese are saying, okay, well, if you're going to do that, then you can't come into China and do what you were doing before. And so this situation is obviously reducing the ability to move goods and services around the world in the most efficient way. So a lot of this is not going to disappear. I think maybe inflation rates will come down and we won't see outright scarcity in Tesco shops at the weekend eventually, but we're not going to see the sort of prices and ability, delivery times for many goods returning to where they were before the pandemic.
Thanks, Michael. Yes, I've not had my car that long. I've already had a begging letter from the dealer asking me to sell it them back. Well, of course, then they want to sell me a new one. I was just going to, I know Temos is waiting. I was going to say, I haven't noticed much shortages of fresh stuff in shops, more that it goes off very, very quickly, which makes you wonder how fresh it is in the first place and how long it has taken to arrive with all the problem with the supply chain. So you might want to say something about that at some point. But that was my observation. Shall we just move on to Temos is next?
First of all, great thanks to Robert for to Michael Roberts for another clear and informative presentation. And I have one or two questions that I would like to ask. First of all, we are talking about the super rich. And this is a concept that's coming on again and again, not only today, but generally the discussions we are doing. And this is something different from the normal talk. We are talking about the capitalists and the bourgeoisie. I think this is important. And is this marking a watershed in which the bankruptcies and the proletarianization of a whole class is beginning to affect the workings of capitalism? I suspect it is, and we can see that on in the way politics is manipulated by these super rich and these really big companies. And once they start manipulating the political rule of the world, then how does this affect the actual workings of capitalism itself? Because obviously this increase in the wealth of these super rich may be, it has other reasons except the normal workings of the market. It is more and more based on manipulation, on financial gambling, on all sorts of actions by these big companies, which really distort capitalist production, distort it greatly. And I would like your opinion on that. The other thing that I wanted to ask, in the latest discussions about taxing the super rich, the big companies, it came out that Amazon will not be paying any tax in this context, because the only companies that will pay this new tax on the big profits are companies that have profits above 10 or 12%, I don't know. Mm-hmm. And Amazon apparently has a profit of 6%.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether this is just a question of manipulation of the books, or yep, whether it is real, in the sense that we have low rate of profit, but really huge volume of profit because of the volume of work these companies are doing. What's your opinion on that?
All very good questions, Temos. Let me say that one of the features of crises under capitalism, to get out of them, is I talked about creative destruction. It was, in effect, a lot of the small companies go to the wall, the so-called zombies we're talking about now, because they're just too weak. The big companies gobble them up, and they're in a position, perhaps after the slump, to take advantage of bigger shares of the market in order to expand and therefore get more profit. So that's how the process of capitalism revives itself, through this of the strong eating the weak. But that means as the strong eat the weak, then the strong get bigger. So what we tend to see over a period of time is an increased concentration and centralization of capital, to use Marx's phrase. By that he means a smaller number of companies control a bigger share of the market in all the different sectors and overall. And so you get an increase in the position where you could call them monopolies, but I think that's an incorrect word. They're oligopolies, to use an economist phrase. That means there are a few big companies. There's not one monopoly. There's a few big companies. They're competing against each other internationally. So there's still competition between these monopolies. And they're also having to compete sometimes against new, smaller companies that have got a better technology or a new idea, which they can break into. But obviously, they try to defend their share of the market as long as they can. And what we've seen in the past 30 years is an increased concentration and centralization. And particularly since the end of the Great Recession, we've seen the rise of these big tech monopolies, they're called in the press. These big tech companies, in America, they're called the FANGs. So you've got Facebook, you've got Amazon, you've got Alphabet, which is Google, you've got Netflix, you've got Microsoft, and so on. These companies are huge tech companies. Alongside the banks, they control a lot of the business. And we've seen in the case of the COVID period, Amazon, dramatic, huge profits being made because it's the way in which people have been getting their goods and services delivered to them by big delivery companies like Amazon. And what a better case is there for public ownership and control of the big delivery companies who provide a public service to everybody in this situation and indefinitely, and they should not be in a position where they can suck up huge amounts of profits because of their position in this environment. But that obviously is not on the agenda of the G7 governments. What was on the agenda of the G7 governments, as Temas pointed out, was a realization that they had to do something, at least to give a fig leaf to doing something about the inequality of wealth and income growing in the world. And one of the things that they agreed was this very limited measure of introducing a minimum tax rate for corporate profits around the world. So countries like Ireland should not be just charging their companies that invest there just 12% minimum. Actually, they charge even less than that by the time they've got exemptions, but they have a 12% in a corporate tax rate, while the US has one at 28 or 25, the UK at 19, 20, and so on. And this is all unequal. And what's also happening is a lot of companies, of course, are not paying any tax at all by putting them into countries like Luxembourg and so on. All their profits are claiming that they make their profits there. So Amazon, for example, claims that it makes billions of profit out of its sales in Luxembourg. Well, of course, this is ludicrous. There's 3 people in Luxembourg with an Amazon plaque in a company office. They don't make all their billions in Luxembourg. They make them in Europe. They make them in the UK. But they book the profits in Luxembourg, and they've been allowed to get away with this process for year after year. As you say, the books are fiddled, not only in this tax way, but as you say, Amazon is not going to pay this minimum corporate income, corporate tax rate of 15% because they claim they don't even get 10% profits. But that all depends on how you write the books up. Big corporate companies have got their big corporate accountants to make sure they get it the way they want. Also, what happens is if you make a loss, and they did during the Great Recession for 2 or 3 years, a lot of these companies, or very new companies, which are huge, can make losses for years. If they start making huge profits, they can count that against all the losses they made in previous years. So they end up paying no tax for year after year after year, which of course has been the case in many cases in Europe and the US. And also they can balance the tax against their supposed investment in technology. So if they buy a load of new technology, new computers for their employees, they can count that against their profits, and so they pay no tax at all. That's why companies like Amazon have paid little or no tax to governments around the world for some time. And just to finish on that point, the G7 decision of a 15% minimum tax on corporate profits sounds great. Well, at least that's an improvement, you might say. But when you look at the devil in the detail, you find that it's all a load of nonsense. Half these companies will not be paying 15%. Countries, what's happening in the case, take the UK and Europe had introduced the financial services tax, where they were taxing financial transactions being done in the stock market and so on. Very tiny percentage, but it would have raised quite a bit of money. Part of the deal the G7 made was, if we had going to have a 15% minimum corporation tax, the UK said, you've got to get rid of the financial services tax. We don't want that. So actually taking off that tax and various other exemptions the UK's asked for and other places means that they actually get less tax. The governments will get less tax than they had before, despite this minimum tax rate. The US has a corporate tax rate of 28% or 25% when Trump did it. Are they going to go down? They're actually going to go down further. So they pay less tax. The corporations will pay less tax in the US if they come back to the US and book their profits because of the reduction towards a 15%. It's actually a race to the floor rather than raising the level across the board. That's a long explanation of this particular deal at Cardiff Bay and the G7. But the general argument is that nothing is really being done about inequalities of wealth and income, whether it's in corporations or whether it's personal wealth. Nothing. Inheritance tax, wealth tax, corporation tax, financial services tax, none of these things are really being applied or being effective. In my view, tax, yes, we should tax the rich more in all these forms, but the real way is to end their way in which they get them so rich. We need control of the production of this value, which is in the companies, which is in the institutions around the world. And of course, that's a completely different thing than just taxing them once they've made their money.
Thanks, Michael. Look, Jimmy Kelly had his hand.
Yeah, I had my hand up, but it's probably a little bit redundant at this stage.
Oh,
but
right.
nevertheless, I'm going.
It's one of the Irish tax people. Yes, they don't pay tax down there.
Not only did the Irish not pay their taxes, sorry, the Irish workers pay their taxes.
Yeah, they do. Yeah,
every penny and every halfpenny of it. And as a recently self-employed person, there is no escape. Absolutely no escape, whether you're on the books or off the books. The point I wanted to, one other thing on that, related to that, you had the contradiction of where Apple has got away for decades now for paying tax, and the European Union decided to enforce Ireland to collect the tax. And the Irish government has so far spent several millions opposing the responsibility to collect that money, while at the same time introducing the cuts. So we know whose side they're on. Now, what was on my mind earlier was in relation to the comments on Tesco. One of the things that I was aware of about Tesco is that they have very few drivers, HGV drivers of their own, that they have in effect subbed out everything. Like, for example, for a couple of years, we had the pleasure here of Eddie Stauber's company with the beautiful lorries with the beautiful ladies written all across them. And they disappeared overnight because a different company had taken. And I understand that Tesco's policy is, like many of the other supermarket multiples, just to simply hire and fire service companies, including transport companies, on the basis of the best deal that they can get. So the question that runs with that is that most of those companies, including Staubert's when they were over here, they used European, mainly Eastern European drivers. The comment used to be said here, particularly with the Russians, most of them learned how to drive going through the Khyber Pass. But, the fact was that a lot of them did have military experience of driving HGVs, and it stood to them. But the question now on that is that there's a wider spread difficulty now for the employers here, in that not only have the lorry drivers gone scarce, but construction trades and other trades have just disappeared as well. That when they were laid off with the COVID outbreaks, some of them were getting a subsidy, but most of them now, the jobs have reopened, but the workers haven't materialized, and it appears a lot of them have gone back to Europe. But that raises a question for trade unions, because normally if there's a shortage of labor, there should be, like the law of supply and demand, it's an opportunity for the prices, for wages to increase, for hours to get shorter and conditions to get better. But one of the problems that I can see in it is that most of the main trades, again in the construction, are tied into agreements where their wages are part of the deal. And the attitude has generally been that what you or I might consider to be a minimum wage is very often interpreted, not just by the employers, but by the trade union leaders as the maximum wage. So you could have a contradiction that there'd be a shortage of labor and no movement and no struggle by the unions. And in fact, a lot of them acting as brakes, defending the agreements that they've signed to hold down the workers. So like I can see antagonisms rising on that particular issue of the possibility of lost opportunities becoming an issue. And the other alternative is where you could have a breakout of one-to-one deals with workers outside of the agreements and potentially outside of the unions as well. So there's a lot of questions to be looked at and see where it goes. The final thing, just going back to the lorry drivers, I think it would do no harm here to recognise that a trade unionist was killed last week in Italy in the supermarket. He was working for Lidl in Italy, and a truck driver took his truck through the picket line and seriously injured 2 workers and killed another. And it would be important to pay respect to that worker and condemn the action of the trucker.
Do you want to come back on any of that, Michael?
Well, I mean, there's nothing really to add to Jimmy's excellent account of the situation in terms of employment. Hopefully, if workers are gaining a little bit more bargaining power, but as he pointed out, that could end up being individual contracts. But if workers could gain a little bit more bargaining power because of the scarcity of labour in this environment, it could lead to some improvements in wage levels, particularly if workers organise, maybe not through the union. Maybe we'll see some more of the old unofficial strikes that we used to see way back before. In fact, as far as I'm aware, I don't know if Jimmy agrees, but actually most industrial disputes these days start by an unofficial action, and then the union has to make up its mind whether it's going to call the ballot or give its support or not. And I think we might see a lot more of that over the next year, unless the labour situation improves and more people are prepared to go back to work for the so-called maximum minimum wage that he's been talking about.
Can I just say something? One thing you haven't mentioned, so is the public sector. What do you think the effect will be on that?
Yeah, I think Jimmy wants to come back quickly and I want to answer that. Yeah.
Unless anybody else wants to say anything. I don't see any hands up at the moment, though. Jimmy?
Yeah, I just want to come back on one particular point, that something that is emerging in Ireland as a reality and is emerging in the UK as a reality, particularly in the engineering and electrical industries, and that is de-skilling and prefabrication, where on-site skills by qualified tradespeople are being bypassed now by manufacturing or part manufacturing installations at lower wages and employing people with lower skills. And that could also turn out to be a focal point for agro. And to their tribute, the electricians in Britain are playing a really good role fighting against it.
This automation is in fact what we're talking about. The old story that if wages look like rising, then capitalists turn towards machinery to replace them in whatever way it can, and de-skill the workforce that's involved in that. That process is continuing. It could accelerate, I think, over the next year, depending on how the balance of forces go on that. On the public sector, well, the argument nowadays is, well, we're not really going to return to austerity. Whereas after the Great Recession, and we had a huge increase in public debt caused by bailing out the banks and because of the depth of the recession, we had to claw that back, said the spokesman to Capitalism. We had to control the public debt. We had to balance the books, just like a household will balance the books. That was the line of the Tories and Cameron and Osborne in the UK, but also everywhere else. The result of that, of course, was to worsen the slump or continue the process of a very depressed recovery by reducing public sector. And the public sector has been slashed to bits, not just in the UK, but across Europe. Every country is suffering it. At the moment, for example, the Swedish government is about to fall. It's a social democratic government because it's introduced a very severe cut in various services provided by the so-called social democracy public sector in Sweden. And a similar policy was adopted during the period from 2010 up to 2020. The argument is that that's changed. Biden's having a bike infrastructure program. Conservatives in Britain talk about spending to level up the economy between the poor and the rich, of course. But if you look at the situation in the public sector, there has been no improvement whatsoever. This is particularly the case in local councils. The slashing of local council expenditure, particularly in looking after the public infrastructure in the local areas, but also in the levels of the local government employees and so on, continues. There is no move towards changing that. And we know, for example, one of the big lessons of COVID was that we really do need social care free at the point of use for everybody that needs it, whether they're old, whether they're ill, and so on. Well, social care is outside the public sector system. It's been privatized to a disastrous extent across the world, but particularly also in the UK. What more could we want than to bring that into the public sector? A policy that was under the Corbyn-McDonnell leadership, a policy of the Labour leaders, and has now been disowned by the current leadership. But the public sector has suffered a 40% real terms cut since 2010 in its spending in local government. And the only areas that have had some growth are health and education, but not enough to compete with the increases in population in children and also in older people going into hospital, apart from the COVID crisis. So the situation is dire, and there's no real change in this situation for the public sector. Not just the workers in the public sector, who have been in a public sector pay freeze for year after year, but also in the services that they can provide. Even the basic legal things required under government legislation cannot be met by councils. And there are several councils, as we know, who have basically gone bankrupt because they don't have the income to actually meet their obligations as councils. So I don't see that this post-COVID period has created the conditions for an improvement in public sector services and workers' conditions. Yes, maybe there'll be no further cuts of any serious nature, although I looked at the last budget and there's actually a 4% cut in real terms planned under the Rishi Sunak budget over the next few years. So there isn't any end of austerity yet. It continues, if not at the same level of disaster under the Osborne-Cameron leadership.
Michael, just as an aside on the subject of de-skilling and local council, I had my bathroom refurbished recently. I live in a housing association property, and it was like having a bunch of cowboys in. I've seen obvious cowboys do better. It was absolutely hopeless. There was almost nothing I didn't have to pull them up about and do something about. So it was just an observation when Jimmy was saying there's this thing now of de-skilling trades and things being pushed into factories. You basically get rubbish. So all this money was paid over to this company that were basically incompetent, really. But I was just saying that as an aside. Right, Dave Buxton.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. It's linked to the question of public services and whether they'll decline any further. I heard something on Radio 4, and it's also in The Guardian, about the 37 billion spent on test and trace. And what the programme said on Radio 4 and what's in The Guardian also is that I think there were two big companies, Serco and one other, that had the contract, but they subcontracted it out to hundreds, if not thousands, of smaller companies. And these smaller companies had some device by which they paid their tax in the Philippines, which meant they paid virtually no tax whatsoever. Now, I think, to my mind, Serco and the other company must have benefited massively by this device. Are you aware of this sort of thing that's going on? And it seems to me, if the Tories allow this sort of thing to go on, then there's not going to be any money for public services, because they'll allow all these private companies to avoid taxes by having subcontractors who are paying minimal tax in places like the Philippines. And also, when I worked in local government, it's a sort of a smaller example of tax avoidance. Many councils license rented accommodation, and in the council I worked for, they had virtually all of the local authority had licensed all of the private rented accommodation, which came to about 30,000 plus. And then when they sent the list of landlords to the tax authorities in Britain, they found out that well over 50% were not declaring the tax they were paying on this rental income. So there's two examples, one you could say small scale and one very large scale, 37 billion on test and trace, and thousands of subcontractors having their tax affairs in the Philippines. What do you think about that, and do you know about it?
Well, yes, I mean, the level of tax evasion and avoidance has been building up for decades now. I think every year there's an estimate by the Tax Justice Network. I recommend looking on their website because they provide a lot of good information on this. And they reckon anything between 50 to 100 billion pounds a year is lost to government revenues through tax evasion and tax avoidance. It's called the tax gap, what should have been collected and what hasn't been collected. And the amount of money invested by government in the Inland Revenue Service to try and collect some of this money is minimal, nothing at all. They spend, apparently, the number of people working on trying to stop people faking their social security benefits is 4 times higher than the number of people they've got employed chasing people who don't pay their tax, particularly big companies. And there are sweetheart deals on these taxes. So I remember the famous one where it was found out that Goldman Sachs had owed the government something like 25 billion pounds they hadn't paid, and they'd broken the rules. So it was negotiated by the head of the Inland Revenue Service, HMRC, and the head of Goldman Sachs for a sweetheart deal. They paid so much to write it off rather than go to court. I don't think we can do that. If we get into a row with the HMRC, we'll be soon hammered into the ground as small businesses or as people on wages alone, apart from the fact that our money is collected at source from PAYE. It is a total and continuing tax scandal, not only in the UK, but in all the major capitalist economies. And the attempts to reduce this avoidance and evasion, as I say, in the case of the G7 deal, is minimal. Nothing at all is really being done about the tax havens, about the tax evasion, and of course, in this case, the straight corruption that's involved in spending 37 billion pounds during COVID on a test and trace system that's outsourced to a company that could not deliver it. They could not deliver it. Even now, test and trace is totally, trace disappears. There's hardly any tracing going on despite this money. And as far as test is concerned, my wife's just been trying to get a test. It's really difficult to get a test to drive into and do, unless you want to pay huge amounts of money for it. There aren't really any free tests unless the NHS says you've got to have one and they've got the certificate and all the rest of it. And even then it takes ages because they do not have the facility. My sister lives in Denmark. The whole country is test. You can go around the corner and get a test in 10 minutes for free. We spend 37 billion pounds in the UK, this government. And where is the test and trace system? It just is non-existent, really, in terms of its ability to meet people's requirements. So we're going to need a lot more tests if people are expected to move around, particularly internationally. I mean, this is just one example of the corruption through outsourcing. And of course, every day we can read about what the UK government's cabinet ministers and their mates have been doing, getting contracts on the side. And of course, Mr. Matt Hancock, it turns out, not as if just a question of breaking the social distancing rules in the office with somebody, but also that somebody turns out to have a brother who is a leading private health person with contracts with the government, and that she was employed by Hancock without going through the procedures in order to provide advice to him, although actually she has all kinds of connections with the private health sector. And so it goes on.
Thanks, Michael. It seems to take nearly 10 days to be told you have to isolate for 10 days as well. It's just completely useless.
Yes.
Crazy. Sam Key.
Hello.
Are you there, Sam Key?
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you for allowing me to ask a question. First of all, just a few comments. Thank you for the graphs, Michael. They are brilliant. Want to look at them in further details later on. Because this is also a meeting about the workers. What can the workers do in this crisis? I wanted to ask about what do you think about the anti-lockdown protest that's happening not only in the UK but also around the world. Some of them actually in the name of anti-government suppression against the freedom of protesting and all sorts of resistance that they think they can use in the name of anti-lockdown. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think about this? Because as you have said, in China and also in the West, there are different ways of dealing with this pandemic. And the workers in China, they take a completely different approach. They work with the government, they support the lockdown, but at the same time, they organize themselves to help in making this lockdown work. Because as we all know, it is not just for everyone to sit at home and doing nothing, because you need a lot of logistics, arrangement to make sure that people who are in need can still meeting their needs. So these need coordination and organization of people who can deliver. So workers can be working together with the government in dealing with this, but I don't really see this happening in the West. And I wonder what do you think about this, and what is your comment on this? Is it going to change with a change of leadership, or is it just really a deep-seated culture issues?
Well, so
Thanks,
I mean, the first thing to say about this is that, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, that COVID is not another flu. It is a much deadlier disease. It's much more infectious than flu. It's much more damaging, not only in deaths, it seems, but also in long-term after effects than flu on the whole delivers. Yes, there are many other diseases in the world that kill more people, but we have this pandemic which could have been prevented. And if we've got to control the number of deaths and the illnesses that take place, then action had to be taken to control it. And how could that be done? Well, as I argued, it's first of all, there was prevention, which of course was non-existent in terms of being warned in advance. And then there is the question of control itself. And the best way to control it, if we had a really excellent test and trace service in place in all the major economies, with a health system geared up to deal with this pandemic emergency, then we could have got people identified with the disease, isolated more quickly, and as you say, with the social resources to back them up if they have to isolate, or if they go into hospital, then we have the resources to handle that. And if you remember at the beginning of the pandemic in the UK and elsewhere, the hospitals were completely overwhelmed. They were unable to cope with this. They didn't have the facilities, they weren't prepared, they didn't have the resources to do this. So most governments, initially reluctantly, in the case of the UK, they tried to avoid it for a whole month, making the situation worse. We had to go into lockdowns, which of course damaged the economy and can possibly damage people's jobs and livelihoods permanently. But there was no alternative, was there, to a significant lockdown? And as you say, if you're organizing lockdowns, then it requires a lot of logistics, state organization and planning. And then we've just been discussing how that was totally missing in the case of the UK, the US, and other European countries to various degrees. So I don't think it's a matter of culture. I think it was a matter that in the case of the advanced capitalist countries of this world, the government's here aim is to maintain the profitability of capital. And lockdowns means the reduction of the profitability of capital to almost zero for a period of time if the lockdowns are that severe. So they're always continually looking ways to get out of the lockdown and break them up and then provide the conditions for profitability, even at the expense of people's lives and illness. Now, the anti-lockdown movement is a complex one, it seems to me. It's a bit of a mess, really. There are some people who are against lockdowns and masks, it seems, because they consider that governments are using this lockdown to impose anti-democratic repressive measures, using the police and other laws to close down people's lives. The extreme position is that the actual lockdowns were deliberately for that purpose. They weren't a response to the crisis, on the health crisis, but were a deliberate policy of repression. I don't think that can be proven in any case. It seems to me that yes, governments have tried to introduce laws that we'll find useful after COVID, perhaps control demonstrations and so on, but I don't think that was the reason for the lockdowns. They're the product of the incompetence and failure of capitalist governments in particular to deal with this. So this crisis. So the argument that you've got to oppose lockdowns seems to me, both on a health level, completely wrong, given, depending on the situation, in the case of the UK, clearly completely wrong. And secondly, developing some sort of conspiracy theory of capitalist governments, when it's much more likely that they started off with their total incompetence. And that, frankly, is a much more powerful argument to people than to argue that there was a deliberate plot to cause everybody to lock down, to control people's lives. And of course, a lot of other elements have become involved in these anti-lockdown demonstrations, which don't appear to be related to people's democratic rights, but more to some sort of attempt to actually open up the economy for the benefit of petty bourgeois and capitalist interests. And so I think the example of China, but not just China, but some of the other East Asian economies, of dealing with this crisis is not so much a product of culture, maybe Sam would tell me different, but more the product of how you organize through state investment and planning and local organization, rather than what we have in the West, which is no state investment, no state planning, and basically an ad hoc, chaotic position, which has led to these situations. It's ironic now that we had a lockdown demonstration this weekend, an anti-lockdown one, when the lockdowns are virtually over. They say, well, there could be delayed. Well, you know, so the issue is neither here nor there really at this point. So the lockdowns have lost a lot of the anti-lockdown demonstrations are fading. Not much of a turnout.
Thanks, Michael. Right. Oh, sorry. Yeah, thanks, Sankey, for your question. Right, I've got 3 hands up now, so I'm planning to let the next 3 speakers speak one after the other. So if there's any response, if Michael could do that at the end, we'll see if anybody else puts their hand up as well. Is that okay? So Finn, I think you were first.
Yes, Comrades, I want to comment on this question of the anti-lockdown protests. And I can only speak about Ireland because that's from my experience, I have the detail. The anti-lockdown movement, in so far as you can call it that, in Ireland is led by right-wing organisations, openly, blatantly right-wing, anti-immigrant organisations. To the extent that the Irish Congress of Trade Unions have launched a campaign against these groups, and the main slogan is that anti-mask is anti-worker, anti-vaccine is anti-worker. It's when you bear in mind that the shop workers, bus workers, not to mention health and care workers, people like that had to...
Sorry, Finn, I've accidentally muted you. Can you mute yourself again? I was trying to put your hand down and I muted you by mistake. Very sorry.
Anyway, the point is that the trade union movement has been mobilised to oppose these anti-masking, anti-vaccine groups because of their association with right-wing organisations. In fact, last weekend we had a rally, a safe rally in terms of distancing and masking and so on. Quite a big crowd there. And the Dublin Trades Council, which I'm involved with, I mean, I spoke at the meeting, but there's quite a large turnout and a very, very good response to the movement because it's been characterised as anti-worker. And it's blatant in Ireland, the link between the right-wing organisations and the anti-masking, anti-vaccine groups. They've also become involved in housing and other kind of issues as well under pretence that they stand for equality, but in fact what they stand for is the exclusion of immigrants. So I can't speak for other countries, but there isn't the slightest doubt in Ireland, the anti-masking, anti-vaccine group is led by the right wing. Now there are legitimate questions. It's a different issue. People do ask questions about pregnancy, long COVID, well, long-term effects on the vaccine. I mean, I can't deal with them in any detail, obviously, but I'm just saying there are legitimate concerns which have to be answered and dealt with. We can't just dismiss the whole thing. We have to answer these questions. But nonetheless, the movement is undoubtedly and unquestionably led by right-wing groups in Ireland, and the trade union movement is mobilising both at Irish Congress level and at local level to oppose these anti-masking, anti-vaccine groups?
Thanks, Finn. I believe in London yesterday, which, as we know, there was an anti-vax march, but there was a very much bigger People's Assembly march, so I am told.
Yeah.
Don't know if anybody was on that. Obviously, I'm not near enough to go, really, but that's what I've been led to believe. So that's rather good. Ed.
Thanks, Pam. Well, I'd just like to add to this part of the discussion about the sort of anti-lockdown attitudes. Where the pandemic is believed to have started in the Wuhan area, I think it's been quite well documented and probably accurately in the press that initially the Chinese government was very slow to react to the development of this virus and the initial stages of the pandemic in that area, for all kinds of reasons, and particularly probably because they hoped that if they kept a lid on the news about it, then the thing might not spread and might not become such a big scandal for the Chinese government. And I mean, it's difficult to get detailed news of what workers in China do and think because of problems in the way news is got out of China. But the sources that we have indicated that the initial measures to develop a lockdown in the Wuhan area were not taken by the Chinese authorities, but were taken in self-organization by communities of working class people in Wuhan who began to realize that this was an extreme threat to the health and the lives of citizens of Wuhan. And when this grassroots spontaneous movement for kind of self-improvised lockdown measures in Wuhan developed, then the Chinese government realized that this was something serious and began to take some sort of responsibility for it. So we can see, even in a totalitarian country like China, the intelligence of the working class and the ability to organize in communities was a big factor, which is an indication, by the way, of the kind of ways policies could be made in a socialist world, in a democratic world, where communities are able to contribute to policy making. So I think that kind of backs up the point that Finn was making, that the impetus to develop safe policies, and if you like to say that the lives of citizens and the health of citizens is more important than the successful operation of the economy, that comes from the people, from the working class. And there's just one other dimension to this pandemic that I want to comment on. After the SARS pandemic in 2003, the big pharmacological companies of the world, there are about a dozen of them, were all warned that this type of virus needs thorough investigation because implicit in the way the SARS pandemic developed is the threat of a new and much more virulent and much more global pandemic. And all dozen or so of these big pharmaceutical companies did nothing about it. They could have used, they could have used it was a 10-year lead-in period to understand better this type of virus, how it is shaped, how it mutates, how it strikes the human body, how it can find ways in. They could have done long-term research, but in the words of a Cambridge virologist who was trying to work on this project, it's like watching 6-year-olds play football. They all run towards the ball with no strategic spreading out of the tasks. And all 12 of these companies were looking for not what long-term research could tell them about how humanity could be saved in 10 years' time. But where the profit was now, if there's no pandemic, there's no research. And if anything illustrates the need for pharmacy companies, pharmacological companies, to be in the hands of the people, to be democratically controlled by socialist states, rather than operating in a search for company profits, that illustrates that we instead of scrambling to produce viruses as this pandemic began to kill millions of people, the scientific resources of humanity could have been at the ready, with viruses ready to go when this pandemic first began. It's another illustration of the point Bob really ran through his entire lead off, of the importance of getting rid of the capitalist system and replacing it by a socially owned economy.
Thanks very much for that, Ted. Temos.
Well, I fear that I shall be the odd man out here about this question of the pandemic. I don't want to talk generally because I couldn't really say, but in Cyprus, what happened, it was really a scandal. The government really used the pandemic as a weapon against the people. The government in Cyprus was in deep trouble with scandals and with golden passports and money laundering, and suddenly the pandemic came about. What did they do? First of all, they closed the checkpoints. When before any single incident of COVID happened in Cyprus, because they wanted to raise the nationalist feeling, cut off the Turks, so that they don't spread the pandemic. Then some incidents started to happen in Cyprus. Some COVID cases were coming through the official airports, of course. The first thing that struck was that the cardiology department of Nicosia Hospital, with a doctor falling ill there. And they panicked, and they started dishing out orders of lockdowns, of not permitting any event, and suddenly and explaining nothing. They never managed to put up some proper study of the situation, some coherent measures, and people were just being ordered to do various things. Then they started to realize that everybody was talking about the pandemic, about the illness, and the scandals just went away. So they started pumping up the fear within among the people, and they were taking decisions like demonstrations are banned, because some demonstrations were happening against the locking, against the closing of the checkpoints, and this continued for a long time with longer lockdowns, and nothing really happened. And then they started exploiting the pandemic to make money. They were importing all sorts of test kits. They were importing safety equipment, and they were giving the contracts lots of money to their friends, to their relatives, and anybody who was saying anything against it, they were calling him that they are not thinking about human health. They are only thinking about their money. And I don't think that it's something that we should take lightly. I mean, of course, they don't want to lose the profitability of their companies, but we don't want to lose our jobs either. And it's not as if it's either lockdown or nothing. there is a lot of things that could be done. There are a lot of things that we should take seriously this illness, because I agree that it's a serious situation. It's not something to be taken lightly. But what happened? We failed as the left in Cyprus, at least, to oppose the government authoritarian measures that were being taken. And who stepped in? On the one hand, the extreme right and the lunatics of the conspiracy theories about the pandemic, and on the other hand, and in a much more serious and dangerous manner, the church. We started to say, look, we don't have to look at our grandparents as lepers, or the grandparents to see their grandchildren as lepers and just instantly. We cannot be dying in the hospital without anybody looking with us. The church was saying the tradition of this church is for people to tend people, the ill people, and not leave them die by themselves. And we are all going to die someday. So we take care about so that we take protective measures, but we don't lose our humanity. And this is in Cyprus what was happening. Of course, not all the church people were saying this, but some groups of fanatic or fundamentalist people were taking it seriously, and they were gaining ground in among the people because of all this. So I think we should be very careful of this, realize that the governments weaponized COVID-19, but that they used it to further their own grip on the people, and we failed to have a proper reaction to that, at least in Cyprus. I suspect that elsewhere is not much different. Maybe the details and the specifics are different, but the general idea, I can see the same thing happening all over the world. So I would be extremely reluctant to sign up to lockdowns without all these explanations being dished out. I mean, instead of losing all this money from the lockdowns for the economy, they could use it to beef up the care industry, to beef up the hospitals, to set out a health system that could care for the people, and that could be left as a positive legacy after COVID. I mean, why have long waiting lists for patients? Because we had patients in Cyprus who were waiting for a bed for 2 or 3 months, 6 months, a year even, because of lack of a lack of proper healthcare system. We could do that with less money than we lost through the lockdowns and through the disruption of the economy that we have seen.
Thanks very much, Thomas. I can see Jimmy's got his hand up.
Okay, what I wanted to come in on was the issue of Wuhan. Like, we all know that the virus is accepted, that the major outbreak began in Wuhan, and in Hubei province, about 4,500 people have died so far. Now, I say so far because despite the fact that you had the bureaucracy caught on the back foot, where initially you had the denial, and then once they accept that they had a real problem, they had to pioneer the response. Now, a couple of interesting figures. While Brazil and Britain and America and the rest of the world have been faced with accelerating deaths and infection, since April, May 2020, when there was a peak of about 46 cases in Hubei province, which includes Wuhan. Now, these figures are from the Johns Hopkins University. Since May of last year, there has been practically no deaths in Hubei. There was one case of infection in November, And in the last 14 days, there was another case of infection in one of the towns to the south of Wuhan. Now, the reason I have a special interest in it is that I have a son living in Wuhan and has lived right through this. Both he and his wife are back at work. They're taking voluntary precautions of wearing masks. They're interacting in the school. He's teaching in the school, working with children. Their home has been built and the builders are at work every day. And normal life in Wuhan is going on. Now, the contradiction that's there is that they started from the worst possible position with something they didn't know what they had and didn't know how to react. But they have adopted the method recommended by the Chinese government and applied right across the Chinese regions. When an outbreak is notified, there is an immediate lockdown in that area. But the more important part about it is when the lockdown starts, there is mass testing.
Yeah.
Now that requires investment. Now that mass testing then shows up where the cases are, and they are then isolated and treated.
Yeah.
And once that's done, the region, the area, the province becomes a safe province until the next breakdown. Now, if you can get Wuhan down to 1 or maybe 2 cases in a year after bearing the responsibility, surely that lesson must be obvious to the world leaders who are struggling with programs of vaccination. Now, incidentally, I don't have any information on what the vaccination percentage is in China or in Wuhan. I just don't have those figures, and I'm curious about them. But what is more important is that even if everybody's been vaccinated or nobody's been vaccinated, there's a very, very simple way: invest in treatment, invest in lockdown, invest in isolation, and contain it. And then life can go back to normal. It's so simple. And yet, because in most cases it requires a state administration, a state decision, and state responsibility over the vested interests in those areas, it's successful. And from the information I get from my son is that it's a popular policy. And whatever criticisms there are of the Chinese government, regionally and nationally, those the role that they have played and the policies that they developed are accepted and welcomed by the population that they're in contact with in their own communities. So I just leave it at that.
Bring Michael back in perhaps for 10 minutes. You just want to comment on either of the subjects we've discussed tonight, but particularly the former one. So if you could do that in about 10 minutes, that would be great. Thanks, Michael.
I think I'll do it less than that, Pam, because
okay.
I think I don't really have much more to say about the COVID situation, which people have, as you say, concentrated on the latter part of the discussion, because I think people have covered it very well. I just had a quick look at the China vaccinations, and they're up to the world average now. They started more slowly, but they're shooting up pretty quickly now. Once the government decides it's going to start a vaccination program, then it really rolls out pretty fast. But of course, they haven't had to do an immediate vaccination program like we've had to do in the so-called West because of our failures to control the infection and keep cases down through these drastic lockdowns on occasion. They're always drastic, and the other measures. As Timos says, if you don't have test and trace, if you don't have methods to socially isolate and protect the old and ill in the situation, then governments have resorted to lockdowns because they haven't got any other alternative program which they ought to have had. In the case of the UK, we actually sent our old people who've got infections back to the residential units where they came from and where they infected everybody else, despite the health secretary lying to tell us that that wasn't the case. So the situation and the way in which the lockdown has been dealt with varies, and we can see the variation, how you approach it from a state perspective of planning for local cooperation, as Sam Keating was saying, and from organising test and trace on a proper basis. You can transform the picture, even if you're trying to catch up from having been hit by an unexpected virus like this. But in the West, we haven't seen such policy adopted. And what that tells me, and this is the main point to be making in this discussion, is that the mode of production based on production and meeting people's needs only if there's profit for a very small number of companies and owners of industry is a system where companies compete to produce things, to sell things to consumers, to make a profit, is such an anarchic and wasteful and useless way of organizing human resources to meet social need. And the COVID pandemic, if it's proved anything, has proved how weak and feeble and inadequate and wasteful and eventually repressive as well such a system is, and how badly humanity needs to replace that system with something which aims at social need, through planning for social need, and that means through common and public ownership and democratic control by the people over the resources. Ed Bober mentioned the pharmaceutical industry, other people have mentioned the tax havens and the huge corruption and profits being made by big companies out of COVID, and we've also discussed in some detail the inadequacies and failures of the capitalist mode of production and its governments to manage the COVID crisis for the benefit and health of people. We're left with hitting 4 million people dead and huge number, 180 million people with infections and with leftovers. This is the result. What could be more demonstrating to us, and should be, to the need for a different system to organize things? I'll finish on this point, Pam. I think if you went out in the campaigning and wherever it is, in elections or unions or elsewhere, there's hardly anybody, even in the US, who would not say that what you need is a public health and social care system delivered to where everybody needs it, free at the point of use, and that should be financed by society as a whole as a most effective, necessary measure that comes as a lesson out of COVID. And yet that is not going to happen while we have the existing governments have in most countries, and it's not going to happen in the UK, where we supposedly have an NHS which doesn't actually cover all the needs, the social and healthcare needs of the population effectively, because it's been so weakened over the past 30 or 40 years. So that is the biggest lesson. We need to end the private profit system and move to a system that plans for social need, and that means why the labour movement needs to struggle. Capitalism is not going to get out of this crisis by delivering these things. That's what the World Economy report I presented to you is saying. It's not going to grow faster. It's not going to boom out of this. It's going to crawl along in the same way as it did before, with every prospect of a further slump down the road. So that increases our intensity in the labour movement to look for an alternative that really does meet the needs of people.
Well, thanks again, Michael, for an absolutely excellent presentation. I think we've had a really comprehensive and incisive discussion about it tonight. So, or this afternoon, should I say. So, another big thanks for coming. We always find your presentations extremely interesting and very, very informative. So,
too many graphs is what people say.
Too many graphs. I wasn't going to say that, but I have heard that said. But nonetheless, that was really good, Michael, I think. So thanks again, and thanks to everybody for your contributions and your thoughts and your questions.